For 100 years, America has had one dependable enemy, one shadow on the wall, one name that could end a Senate career, justify any budget, or start a war: Russia. The fear started before the Cold War. It survived the Soviet collapse. It got recycled, rebranded, and sold to every new generation. But here is the question nobody in Washington is eager to answer. What if a century of obsession with Russia helped America miss the threats actually eating it alive from the inside? This is not a defense of Russia. Russia under Putin is an authoritarian state that invades neighbors, poisons dissidents, and holds elections the way a magician holds a card trick. All documented fact. The issue is something different. There is a significant gap between an adversary that deserves attention and an existential monster that justifies 100 years of foreign policy decisions. Today, we look at what Russia actually is, by the numbers, in 2025. Then we ask who and what is the real threat America should have been watching all along. "100 years of the same story." The fear of Russia did not start with the Cold War. It was already a feature of Western strategic thinking in the late 1800s when Imperial Russia was expanding east toward the Pacific. The country was large, unpredictable, and always seemed to be growing. Then, 1917 happened. The Tsar fell, the Bolsheviks took over, and things got dramatically worse for ordinary Russians before they got any better. The revolution, the civil war that followed, Stalin's collectivization campaigns of the 1920s and 1930s, and the political purges combined to kill tens of millions of Soviet citizens. The purges of 1937 and 1938 alone killed approximately 750,000 people, a figure confirmed by declassified Soviet records after the USSR collapsed.
Nicholas II, the last Tsar of Russia, might actually qualify as the last Roman emperor. The Russian Tsars claimed direct succession from the Eastern Roman Empire through the marriage of Ivan III to Sophia Paleologos, the niece of the final Byzantine emperor. From that moment on, Moscow called itself the Third Rome, and the Tsars styled themselves as the legitimate heirs of Rome's imperial lineage. So if dynastic bloodlines mattered and the title of Caesar survived in the form of Tsar, then the Roman Empire didn't finally fall until the Bolsheviks executed Nicholas II. Does that make him the last Roman emperor?
The Cold War that followed was real. The nuclear threat was real. Soviet intelligence was genuinely active and capable on American soil. The fear had a legitimate foundation, but the fear also became an industry. McCarthyism destroyed hundreds of careers on evidence that ranged from thin to completely fabricated. The military-industrial complex that President Eisenhower specifically warned about in his 1961 farewell address, a machine built around the Soviet threat, developed its own financial interest in keeping that threat large and credible. Defense budgets, weapons programs, think tanks, and political campaigns all fed on the same fear for decades. Then in 1991, the Soviet Union collapsed. Not from a military confrontation, not from a nuclear exchange, from the weight of its own economic failures and the impossibility of holding an empire together through fear alone. It simply fell apart. Washington was left with a massive national security apparatus built to fight a superpower. The superpower was gone. The apparatus stayed. The search for a reason to keep it funded and operational never really stopped. That context matters for everything that follows. The story being told about Russia has never fully updated from the one Eisenhower inherited, and that failure to update has cost America something real, which becomes clear the moment you look at the actual numbers. The economy nobody wants to talk about. The single number that should reframe every Russia conversation is this. Russia's GDP in 2024 was approximately $2.17 trillion, according to World Bank data. China's GDP that same year was $18.8 trillion. The United States sits at approximately $29 trillion. Russia's entire economy is roughly 1/13 the size of America's. It is smaller than South Korea, smaller than Italy, roughly comparable to the economy of the state of Texas if Texas were an independent country. This is not a temporary condition caused by the post-2022 sanctions. Russia has had a small economy relative to its geopolitical ambitions for a long time. The Soviet Union appeared economically formidable, partly because it was opaque. Western analysts could not clearly see inside the numbers. When Soviet archives opened after 1991, economists discovered the Soviet economy had been significantly smaller and more dysfunctional than Cold War estimates had assumed. The threat had been partially a product of what America could not see. The structure of today's Russian economy makes the problem worse. It runs on energy. Oil and natural gas dominate exports, meaning when energy prices are high, Russia has money, and when prices fall, the fiscal picture gets ugly fast. That is not the profile of a global superpower. That is the profile of a large developing country sitting on enormous oil reserves and a massive nuclear arsenal. The post-2022 sanctions did real damage. Russia managed better than some early predictions suggested, largely by redirecting energy sales to China and India. But think about what that adjustment actually reveals. Russia had to reorganize the structure of its entire economy to sustain a military campaign against a country with a GDP roughly 1/10 its own size. A genuinely dominant power does not have to strain itself to that degree fighting a neighbor. That strain is the data point people are not discussing. The gap between what Russia spends on military ambitions and what it can actually produce without gutting the rest of its economy is one of the most underreported facts in modern geopolitics. It sets up everything that happened next in Ukraine, and what happened in Ukraine changed the entire picture. What the Ukraine war actually revealed. The conventional wisdom going into February 2022 was that Russia would overrun Ukraine in a matter of days. Western intelligence assessments suggested Kyiv could fall within 72 hours. Some European governments were quietly preparing to recognize whatever replacement government Russia installed. None of that happened. Russia's initial assault on Kyiv collapsed. Russian logistics, the supply lines, the fuel depots, the ammunition chains proved deeply inadequate for sustained offensive operations. Russian command structures were chaotic. The combined arms doctrine that looked impressive in exercises and in Syria fell apart completely against a motivated, well-led defense. The cost since then has been staggering on every level. Western officials reported to Bloomberg estimated approximately 1.2 million total Russian casualties, killed and wounded combined, by early 2026. A February 2026 investigation by Mediazona and the BBC, using death certificates and publicly verifiable records, identified over 200,000 Russian soldiers confirmed killed. The U.S. Army's own intelligence assessment found that by mid-2024, Russia had lost more main battle tanks than its entire active-duty tank inventory at the start of the conflict. Over 6,000 armored fighting vehicles were gone. The flagship of the Russian Black Sea Fleet, the Moskva, was sunk by Ukrainian missiles in April 2022. A country with no surface navy of its own sank Russia's most important warship in that theater. The American factor has to be acknowledged, honestly. Ukraine received over $100 billion in Western military and economic support, the bulk of it American. The weapons systems, intelligence sharing, and financial backing were critical to Ukraine's ability to fight. Ukraine's performance cannot be separated from that support. But think about what that means from the other direction. Russia, with its full military apparatus, shorter supply lines, home field advantage, and the full weight of its defense industrial base, spent over 3 years in a costly, grinding, inconclusive campaign against a country it was supposed to conquer in a week. A country kept alive largely by outside help, yes, but kept alive, not conquered. This is the military capability of the nation American policy treated for generations as capable of rolling over Western Europe at will. The data says the threat assessment needed serious revision long before any of this began.
While many people have said that the Russian economy has held up during the war, the data shows a very different picture. What the data shows is an economy that has lost all productivity. It's hanging on oil and gas right now, but GDP growth in 2025 was 0.6%. Manufacturing is in decline. Inflation continues to be high. Russia is spending a massive amount on its war effort right now. So that is building weapon systems and other types of equipment and goods used for the war. It gives sort of a false sense of the state of the economy, because when you look at the top 100 technology companies in the world by market capitalization, there are 0 Russian companies in that list. You got 60 American companies from NVIDIA to Google to Amazon. You got Chinese companies, Taiwan. There are no Russian companies. So Russia has become a backwater for general productivity. The war hides all of that right now.
Before moving to who actually threatens America, there is one more piece of the Russia picture that rarely gets discussed in full, and it may be the most important one of all. A country running out of people. Russia is running out of people. The war accelerated a crisis that was already building before the first Russian tank crossed the Ukrainian border in 2022. Russian male life expectancy stands at approximately 67 to 68 years. Men in neighboring Norway live to 81. Men in Finland live to 79. Russian men are more than 3 times as likely to die between the ages of 15 and 60 as their British counterparts. Cardiovascular disease, alcohol-related illness, and dangerous working conditions have been driving early death for decades. This is not a wartime statistic. This was the baseline before any fighting started. Russia's fertility rate is approximately 1.40 children per woman as of 2024. The number required to maintain a stable population is 2.1. The gap between those two figures has been producing a structural population deficit for years, and the war made it dramatically worse. When Putin announced partial mobilization in September 2022, an emigration wave followed almost immediately. Estimates suggest between 500,000 and 800,000 Russians, educated and male, left the country within months. Software engineers, doctors, scientists, entrepreneurs, gone to Georgia, Armenia, Kazakhstan, Germany, and the United States. These are the exact people a modern economy needs most to function and grow. In 2024, Russia recorded 600,000 more deaths than births, a 20% increase over 2023. The UN projects Russia's population will shrink from approximately 146 million today to around 135 million by 2050 if current trends hold. Some independent demographers put the trajectory even lower. Here is what that adds up to. The country that American foreign policy has treated as an existential threat has an economy smaller than Texas, has burned through over 1 million soldiers in 3 years, fighting a neighbor it was supposed to crush in 72 hours, and is simultaneously losing its young working-age population at a pace that will haunt it for generations. Whatever Russia is, it is not the picture the past 100 years of American strategic thinking drew.
The worst demographic crisis in living memory is coming for Russia whenever the war is over. I am the Life Professor. Welcome back to my statistics. This is a scam series, and right now the fertility rate in Russia is about 1.4 children per woman, which puts it well below the 2.1 needed to maintain population. Now, this would put it in the categories like Japan, where they have had a shrinking population. However, Russia's is much worse, because while others have come from people just having less and less births, which they are also having in Russia, Russia's big decline in population has come from this other little thing that you see going on. This is what demographic experts call the Russian cross, where it's the death rate exceeds the birth rate in Russia, and you can see it reached a little bit, we were doing okay back in 2015, and now it's only continued to go back down. Biggest single reason for this demographic crisis that doesn't go boom is alcohol, which means that as time goes on, more and more Russian men pass away before women do. All these dark red ones are women's surplus, which you can see only increases as time goes on. And I don't know if you've been keeping up with the news that much, but there's been this special military operation that's been going on for a little while now, and all of those people who have passed away in that conflict are also, adding on to the bad line. Something which has only been accentuated by hundreds of thousands of particularly educated, particularly young men fleeing the country. What this means is that there is going to be literally millions of spots in the Russian economy that are just not filled by the missing working age men, and also the missing children that those men would have had. Right now, the country can keep putting band-aids on bullet holes, but once this conflict is over, that's whenever the real casualties are going to start to show. Follow for more stuff that you can't stop thinking about.
Knowing what Russia actually is only matters if it changes the question. And the question that changes is the obvious one. If not Russia, then what? The threat that actually kept growing. While Washington spent decades calibrating its posture against Russia, a different country was doing something that had never been done before at that scale or speed. In 1980, China's economy was smaller than Italy's. In 2024, China's GDP was $18.8 trillion, the second largest on Earth, and by purchasing power measurements, the largest economy in the world. That growth trajectory, that speed across that scale of population, has no real historical precedent. China used that economic growth to fund a military buildup that is, by any serious measure, the most significant shift in global military balance since the Soviet expansion after World War II. The People's Liberation Army Navy has built more warships in the last decade than most countries possess in their entire fleets. China's missile arsenal, including the DF-21 and DF-26 systems with ranges up to 2,500 miles, is specifically designed to push American carrier groups out of the Western Pacific and deny the U.S. military the ability to operate near Taiwan in the event of a conflict. The Pentagon's annual China Military Power Report, released in December 2025, stated plainly that the People's Liberation Army continues to progress toward being able to achieve a strategic decisive victory over Taiwan by 2027. That is not an outside analyst's estimate. That is the U.S. Defense Department's own formal assessment. Taiwan matters for a reason that goes beyond geography. Taiwan produces the majority of the world's most advanced semiconductors, the chips that run everything from smartphones to the targeting systems in American precision weapons. If China were to take control of that production capacity, the leverage over the global technology supply chain would be difficult to overstate. This is not a peripheral concern. It is a central strategic vulnerability that gets a fraction of the public attention it deserves. Then there is fentanyl. According to the CDC, fentanyl-related deaths in the United States totaled 76,282 in 2023. That number dropped to approximately 48,422 in 2024. Still an enormous figure, and the precursor chemicals used to manufacture the drug flow predominantly from Chinese chemical companies through Mexican cartels into American communities in every state in the country. The DEA has documented this supply chain extensively. By any honest accounting, fentanyl has killed more Americans in the past decade than any foreign military action in the country's modern history.
According to the CDC, fentanyl overdoses have killed more people since 2020 than COVID-19 car accidents and suicides.
Fentanyl fatalities have nearly doubled since 2019. The CDC says the synthetic opioid is now the leading cause of death for Americans 18 to 45 years old. The country lost more than 37,000 people during 2020 and 41,500 people just this year between the ages of 18 and 45. Data from Families Against Fentanyl suggests one person dies from an overdose every 8.5 minutes.
It's affected all classes, all races. I don't see anyone that's immune to this.
Street drugs including heroin, cocaine, and even marijuana have all been reported to have traces of fentanyl. Experts say the stress of the pandemic has led more people to use these type of drugs, as well as the holidays, which can be hard for those struggling with addiction.
Russia did not build that pipeline. Russia is not running that operation. The country consuming the most American lives through a deliberate supply chain is not the one getting the most attention in foreign policy circles. China's military buildup and the fentanyl supply chain are two separate issues, but they share a common thread. Both have been growing for years while the foreign policy conversation stayed anchored to Cold War-era Russia scripts. But the threat picture is still not complete, because the most significant danger is not the one with a flag or a military uniform. The enemy without a uniform. In fiscal year 2025, the United States spent $970 billion on interest payments on the national debt. The defense budget that same year was approximately $874 billion. Interest payments on borrowed money now cost more than the entire U.S. military. Interest is currently the third largest category of federal spending, behind only Social Security and Medicare, and the Congressional Budget Office projects. It will reach $1 trillion in fiscal year 2026 and keep climbing from there.
The U.S. is on an unsustainable fiscal path. The U.S. federal government's on an unsustainable fiscal path, and that just means that the debt is growing faster than the economy.
I have the sense this worries you very much.
Over the long run, of course it does. We're borrowing from future generations. It's time for us to get back to putting a priority on fiscal sustainability, and sooner is better than later.
The national debt crossed $38 trillion in October 2025. The U.S. is now adding roughly $1 trillion to that total approximately every 5 months. The CBO projects the debt will exceed $52 trillion by 2035 if current laws remain unchanged. And for every dollar the federal government collected in taxes and fees in 2025, 19 cents went purely to pay interest on past borrowing. Russia did not run up that debt. China did not run it up either. That was a domestic production. Look at the other pieces of the picture that sit alongside it. American infrastructure received a D+ rating from the American Society of Civil Engineers. The power grid, the water systems, the bridges, the roads. The country that outproduced every other nation on Earth combined during World War II now has supply chains so globally dependent and domestically thin that a pandemic in 2020 revealed it could not reliably manufacture surgical masks or basic pharmaceutical ingredients. Those were not high-tech products. Those were masks and basic medicines. American performance in mathematics and science has declined relative to international peers over multiple decades. The country that put men on the moon is now dependent on foreign-born engineers and scientists for a significant portion of its most critical technical workforce, and the domestic pipeline in advanced STEM fields is not keeping pace with what the country actually needs. The opioid crisis, which began with a pharmaceutical industry that lobbied its way past regulatory safeguards long before fentanyl arrived from Mexico, has killed over 500,000 Americans since 1999. That is more deaths than the Vietnam War, the Korean War, and the Gulf Wars combined, multiple times over. No foreign military caused that. It started in American boardrooms and got signed off on by American regulators. An adversary that can get a country to spend a century focused on an overstated external threat while the internal foundations quietly crack does not need nuclear weapons to win. It just needs to hold the attention somewhere else. The question of who benefits from America's fixation on Russia is worth asking plainly. Defense contractors benefit. Think tanks funded by defense contractors benefit. Politicians who campaign on naming a foreign enemy benefit. The machine Eisenhower warned about in 1961 benefits. The American public gets a much less clear return on that investment. What the threat assessment should actually look like. None of this means Russia deserves zero attention. It does not. Russia is a nuclear power, and that requires serious, sustained deterrence. The combined American and Russian nuclear arsenals account for over 90% of all nuclear weapons on Earth. That is a physical reality that demands intelligent management, regardless of how the rest of the threat picture is calibrated. Russia is an adversarial intelligence power. The GRU and FSB maintain active operations. Russian election interference and disinformation campaigns in Western countries are documented fact. That requires strong counterintelligence work. Russia is a regional military power with demonstrated willingness to use force against its neighbors. That requires NATO solidarity and support for the countries inside Russia's reach. What it does not require is treating Russia as the existential civilizational threat it has been framed as for a century. Those are two different things. Conflating them serves the people who profit from the conflation, not the people paying for it. China requires dramatically more strategic focus than it currently receives relative to Russia. The economic competition, the military buildup, the Taiwan question, the technology race, and the fentanyl supply chain are generational challenges. They cannot be addressed adequately, while the foreign policy establishment is still running Cold War-era Russia scripts from the 1950s. The cartels and the border require an honest security conversation that goes beyond domestic political point scoring. Tens of thousands of Americans dying annually from fentanyl is a national emergency by any definition, regardless of where any individual stands on immigration policy more broadly. And the internal challenges, the debt, the infrastructure deficit, the supply chain fragility, the education gaps, require the kind of sustained national attention that becomes impossible when the political and media ecosystem is permanently pointed at the foreign boogeymen of the moment. America is not a declining power. It remains the world's largest economy, the most innovative society on Earth, the strongest military force in the world, and a country with extraordinary demographic advantages compared to both Russia and China. Those advantages are real and significant. They are also not permanent, and they are not self-maintaining. Russia is not going to defeat the United States. Russia cannot defeat the United States. The nuclear weapons are the insurance policy of a country that understands exactly how limited its conventional options actually are. Putin knows this. His military commanders know this. The nuclear saber gets rattled precisely because the conventional military option against NATO is not viable. The real question has never been whether Russia can defeat America. The real question is whether America will defeat itself. Whether the debt compounds past the point of management. Whether the supply chains stay fragile enough that the next crisis finds the country unable to respond. Whether the political system stays so permanently consumed by performative conflict, foreign and domestic, that the actual work of keeping a great power functioning never gets done. 100 years of the same boogeyman. 100 years of budgets, careers, and campaigns built on the same fear. Updated with better graphics, but the same fundamental story. Meanwhile, China built the world's second largest economy from scratch. The cartels built a fentanyl pipeline that reaches every county in America. The national debt crossed $38 trillion, and Russian men on average do not live to see their 68th birthday. Maybe it is time to update the threat assessment. America's most dangerous enemy does not have a flag. It has a compound interest rate, a porous border, a supply chain built in Shenzhen, and a political class that finds it much easier to point at Moscow than to look in the mirror. If this breakdown gave you something to think about, the next one goes deeper still. Subscribe and turn on notifications. It is the only way to catch it when it drops.